Hello and welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity and the founder of Fearless Women, a company with a powerful ambition to drive positive change for women's sport. I'm incredibly grateful to Barclays for supporting this series of the Game Changers, which will focus on fearless women in football, reinforcing Barclays' huge commitment to the beautiful game. Last year, Barclays announced the biggest ever sponsorship of women's sport in the UK as the Barclays FA WSL became Europe's first fully professional women's football league. A huge amount of their investment also went into establishing the Girls Football School Partnerships, with the aim of ensuring that all girls in England will have equal access to play football in schools by 2024. This week, I'm talking to Dame Heather Rabbatts, a businesswoman whose career has covered law, government, sport and media, with high-profile positions at the FA, Millwall FC, the BBC and Channel 4. Heather now heads the Women's Sports Group, so, as well as discussing her career and advice for leadership, we also explore the future of commercial income for women's sports from rights deals and sponsorships. I began by asking Heather about her upbringing in Jamaica.
Well, I was born in Jamaica, but left actually as a young child, and my upbringing was in part in South London, and then we moved near the Medway towns. And I think it's fair to say, particularly for my mother, who was Jamaican and a very strong black woman, we were in an all-white area and it was pretty tough, basically. So I don't look back to my childhood with lots of fond memories, and school was not easy, you know, at that time where there were certainly no other children of colour or black kids. You know, it was quite a solitary existence. And so I left school, which wasn't a resounding success story, when I was 16, and I managed to finally persuade my parents that I wanted to leave home. And I came to London and I went to an FE college, actually, near St Pancras. And I had my first black teacher, a guy called Max Johnson, who had a profound impact on me and sort of led me to believe that I wasn't quite as stupid as maybe I had been led to believe. And from there, I did A-levels and got myself to university.
Do you feel that the behaviour or how you were treated at school has impacted you through life?
Yes, I think, you know, whenever I talk to particularly people who've been in leadership roles, it's quite interesting how some of their, if you like, insights and skills are forged at quite early ages, and usually have had some sort of adversity, whether it's being bullied or loss of a parent or suffering from early childhood illnesses, for example. And I think there's something about being in a crucible where you're assailed in different ways with various challenges that perhaps gives you, well, it either makes you or it breaks you, I suppose. And I think I was fortunate. I had, two very loving parents who, despite the fact that I was probably a bit of a difficult young girl, always did believe that, I was capable of doing, achieving and doing what I wanted to do. And I think that, together with those experiences, gave me a sort of resilience to life's outrageous slings and arrows of misfortune.
And was sport a part? I mean, you're coming to sport now. Was sport a part of your life?
It was the one thing I really enjoyed at school. So I was captain of the netball team and played hockey, and I was a very quick runner over short distances, which I really, really enjoyed. And I think that was absolutely something where sport and being part of a team was the one area where I felt I could get a sense of belonging. So I sort of escaped some of the solitude, if you like, of being this sort of slightly odd girl who didn't fit in. Even if it was transitory, even if it just lasted for the game, you were part of the team. And so, sport was in that sense, very important to me.
Yeah, very powerful, isn't it? It's really interesting. And your mum had a fascinating background. So you could tell us a little bit about her background.
So my mum, I was with many Jamaicans. Her family moved to New York where they worked, and she worked as a seamstress. But also, it was in those days where, you would model clothes in those couture houses. And she was one of the first Black models to do so. And she was also somebody who loved jazz. Of course, it was all at the time of segregation. And so she brought me up with a great sense of my own identity, but also on the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and jazz, Bessie Smith and Dinah Washington, Billie Holiday, and particularly those artists who, of course, faced huge racism and challenges themselves.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that you went on from school, you went back to FE college to take your A-levels and to study law. What drove you into that in terms of becoming a barrister, a solicitor at the time?
I think there was a number of factors in play. One was I wanted to have a qualification which I felt would assure me of independence. My mum brought me up with, you should always have your own knicker money, as she used to say.
So mine too.
Yeah. On one level, you had to be a dutiful wife, but on the other, it was about having an exit route. So I felt the law absolutely afforded me that opportunity. I was brought up with a strong sense of values, and it was an area where I felt I could make a difference. I could particularly support people in a moment of crisis, and so that's why I went into law. But being a barrister was very challenging. Very erratic pay. I came from state school. It was still, then it hasn't changed hugely, but it is changing. But it was very white male privileged, where colleagues could rely on being supported by their parents, and that was just not possible for me. So when I had my son, I had to really look to get work which was more regular, and where I could leave and pick him up from nursery and all of those other things that so many working mothers have to make those sorts of choices about. And I sort of fell in really to local government, and then discovered I loved being in organisations. I also believe that if you could improve people's housing or social care or just access to education in particular, and improving the quality of schools for so many young people in the inner city, then that was again an area that I felt personally committed to. So having gone in for 5 years, I stayed for 17, and so when I left, my boy was a grown up sort of thing. But and then I've moved into other fields since leaving the public sector some 20 odd years ago now.
When you arrived at Lambeth, I think in your own words, you said at the time it was the most fraudulent, corrupt and incompetent organisation in the country. Why did you take that on? I mean, a massive challenge at the times.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder myself. I think a number of reasons. First of all, I don't believe that any organisation is beyond redemption. I think Lambeth is an amazing place. Brixton is the Black soul of this country, and I felt in many ways much more at home there. And I'm somebody who tell me something can't be done, I'll go, right, let's get on doing something. And I just I absolutely believe that there are always good people in organisations. There are bad people, and there are people who do not want to come with you, and you have to forge an alliance with those who want to come with you to defeat those who want to hold an organisation back. And I worked with some astonishing men and women whilst I was at Lambeth, and with many people in the community. And I think after 5 years, we had managed to put the foundations in to take it away from chaos and absolutely just the most unbelievable level of not only failure, but also the glue that binds public institutions together, its values and public ethos, had been corrupted and eroded by undue political interference over decades, and it takes a long time to reassemble an organisation. And we began that journey when I was there, and it's gone on and improved.
And you were very young. So I think you were 32, were you, when you arrived at Lambeth?
Well, I was the youngest chief exec in the country at 32, I think, as I was a chief exec of another authority before I went to Lambeth.
And how were you received then as a young woman and a woman of colour coming into that organisation? What was the reception like for you at the time?
Mixed. Mixed. I think it was, I think there were some people who had a sense of hope that things might change.
Yeah.
There were many others that thought nothing's ever going to change. It's beyond repair. And then there were others who were invested in ensuring it wasn't going to change, because that's where they derived their power.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult culture. And I think it's only by getting on and doing the stuff that is going to change an organisation that you start to hopefully win the confidence of the people who are slightly biding their time, because you can't get rid of everybody. You can't start with a blank piece of paper. Yeah. You have to work with what you have, and then you have to change things.
And you moved on from there, I mean, other roles in between, but in terms of sport, on to be the chair at Millwall.
Okay, well, yeah, I did some other things.
I realised
on the journey.
I've got 45 minutes.
I know. So, yeah,
you've done so much, haven't you?
I knew that was my last. I've been a chief exec of 3 local authorities by that point. I'd done it. I wanted to do something different. We were very much a football family. Right. My husband at that time worked in sport, and I, in fact, moved initially to Channel 4 and worked in the area of education and public service broadcasting. And then I was headhunted to go and run Millwall Football Club. And Bermondsey was where my dad had originally, in that area he came from. And again, Millwall has an unenviable reputation in many ways, as we know. Again, the overwhelming majority of the fans were really great, and as were the people who worked there. And I was brought in to look to get Millwall promoted and restructured, and we got a great new chairman out of America who invested. In that time, I joined the board of the Football League. I worked on the development of young players. I had been involved for a very long time before all of this with kicking racism out of football, which had been established, now must be 30 years ago. I hate to think how many years we've been involved in that fight and that campaign.
So it was before your Millwall time, sorry.
Absolutely, yeah. And also I had done some work on sports rights during my tenure at Channel 4. So a whole series of things came together. I'd worked in regeneration. I understood sports rights, and I loved sport and football, and that got me involved in Millwall. And then I went on to work, really wanted to pursue my television and sort of creative career, worked with some other production companies, and then set up my own. And in parallel, I always stayed involved with sport. And I applied and became the first woman of colour to be on the FA board in 150 years. For my sins or whatever it was. And then, I think I had 3 chairmen during my time. And that was an interesting experience. And sadly, my husband died about a year and a half ago, and I've taken up the responsibility of running the company he set up. He had worked in sports communications most of his professional life. And I took over Vero Communications, and also then set up the Women's Sports Group last October to really try and focus on women's sport, raising their profile and driving the value of the media rights and sponsorship across all women's sports.
And I want to come on to that in a minute. I'll just take you back, if I can, just to a moment, back to your time at the FA, when you were involved at the FA. Were there other women in senior roles at all at that time that you were taking those? Across football, I guess, in terms of clubs?
Very few. So I was one of the founders of the Women in Football group, and worked, I think initially we had like six people. So coming, I think we could fit in around one person's kitchen table, and now there are 4,000 members. I'm an ambassador for women in football, and very much started to push that agenda around that this was an industry, this was a sector that you could become a chief exec, a marketing, fitness, nutritionist, doctor, and also to challenge some of the culture of behaviour shown to women of harassment and bullying that went on. So there were very few senior women, but certainly we began to find a voice, and that has grown over the last 10 years. There are still very few senior women, and I think there's been a report in the Telegraph recently. I think there's only 3 senior black women across all of sports, not just football. And that's an outrage. And so we know we've got way more to do to ensure that there's equity of representation, particularly given the fact that sport and football is enjoyed by women and men. And we've obviously seen the success of women's football. But within men's football, there are roles that we should see people of colour, women involved in.
You chair the FA's Inclusion Advisory Board as well. Yes. Maybe to explain a little about the Rooney Rule at the time, was that kind of part of that discussion? And I believe recently Richard Masters at the Premier League has said he doesn't feel that's on the agenda now moving forward. What's your thoughts to that? How can we make this change that you say that needs to happen, but how can we make that change?
I think when I was chairing the Inclusion Board, and I know the work that Paul Elliott continues to do there, it is about actually having a series of interventions where all of football have to come together to make some of these changes. So we put together plans for increasing the number of black coaches, about embedding black coaches within the England structure, for example, and the Premier League clubs and Football League clubs beginning to do the same. There has been a trial of the Rooney Rule, which has been voluntary in some of the Football League clubs. I think it's been patchy, that experience. One of the interesting turning points, I believe, is that increasingly players are finding their own voice in these matters. And we've seen Raheem Sterling come out and speak again about the absence of black people on the bench. I mean, it always strikes me when you look at the bench that you see an array of white men. You hardly ever see, certainly, any other women or black people participating. And that's echoed across virtually all of the clubs, despite the fact on the field of play, we have this amazing diversity. And I think it behoves football to absolutely, in these days of Black Lives Matter, to really focus on what it needs to do. And we put plans in place. I know those plans, some of those have been further developed. I think the Premier League are talking about embedding more black coaches in that structure. But it's not just about coaches. It is about chief execs. It's about board members. We set up a course on governance to equip ex-black players to be on boards. You have to change the leadership right at the top of organisations so that there is a 360-degree lens, and where others can see themselves. So if you're a player, you can look to your board and you see people who are like you. And that has to be, I think, one of the big changes that football and other sports now have to face into.
Are you hopeful that we're moving in the right direction?
I go up and down about it. There have been many a false dawn where we thought we'd made a breakthrough. I really hope that in the light of the recent brutal murder of yet another black man in America and the focus that's come on through Black Lives Matter, interestingly, a movement very much set up by black women. And, just as, Me Too and Time's Up, which I'm involved in, have been really led by women and women of colour, that there is an opportunity now, I hope, for there again to be the work, and it is about the work that has to go in to try and dismantle these systems of racism. I am encouraged by a younger generation. When I look at my stepson and his friends and colleagues in their mid-20s who have been participating on some of the marches, but also being really thoughtful about what needs to happen. And I think it is this generation of white people, people of colour, black people coming together to really try and challenge those systems and that culture. And that gives me hope.
Absolutely. I've got 3 teenage daughters, and I would say exactly the same. I think that's where my hope lies. Last year you launched the women's sport group.
Yes.
And I cut you off and took you back to the FA.
That's all right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that organisation and what your hopes are for
Yes.
that?
Well, I think what we all started to see and bear witness to, around particularly the Women's World Cup, was the increasing sort of profile of women's sports. So whether that was women's football or netball or rugby or cricket, there were over 80,000 fans in Melbourne for the Women's Cricket World Cup final, let alone, I think, 2 billion viewers. We are talking about sport which is now gaining really significant audiences. And yet it's still not properly sponsored. Often the broadcast rights are bundled in with the men's rights. And so really there's a lack of investment going back into the women's game. And it's still at an earlier stage of its evolution. And I set up the Women's Sports Group very much to try and focus on driving value in media rights. And as some of these sports now are unbundling, which is what the FA have done, and we're working with the FA, for example, but rugby looking to do the same as our cricket. So drive media value, but also try and look to how do we raise the profile of those sports and those athletes who are participating in those sports, and ensure that their own voice is increasingly heard. And what's the relationship to sponsors? So that's why we set it up. And as I said, we worked with we're working with the FA. We've been involved with supporting Australia and New Zealand's bid to host the Women's World Cup. They've just won, so we're really delighted about that. It was a fantastic victory, and so that's really the focus of our work. Of course, then comes COVID, and I mean, we're all reeling from it. The economy is reeling from it. Sport, every sector, let alone what it's, done for all of us in inglorious lockdown and all of the challenges that so many people are facing, and the uncertainty that we're all looking into as we, start to come out of COVID. But everything feels very fragile, and we know it's fragile. Sport, as we know, has had massive impact. There are serious issues. When will we ever go back into our stadiums? Who knows? And the danger is that women's sport will get left behind, and some of those early shoots will get sort of stamped on. A significant part of our work at Women's Sports Group is to try to ensure that doesn't happen. And some of that is about maintaining a level of confidence around women's sport. So rather than saying, well, it's all doom and gloom, saying, well, it's not doom and gloom, and women's sport will come back. How do we ensure it comes back stronger? The fact that actually it's still less expensive to invest in as a media if you're a broadcaster or a sponsor, and yet it's connecting you with huge numbers in terms of audiences. So I think that if we can position women's sport as part of that renaissance going forward, then I think that gives us all hope, but also it's how do we build women's sport for the future so that it becomes much more sustainable and much more and secures more investment, which goes back into developing players, goes back into the grassroots, goes back into participation. And hugely, I think, we go back to where I started from in terms of my own experience of sport. If you participate as a young girl in sport and stay involved, and that's obviously one of the big challenges that so many young girls leave it as they get to 13 and 14 for all the reasons that we're familiar with. If we can help to ensure that there is a profile around women athletes that says, wow, I could do that. I might not want to be professional, but I might want to play with my mates, football or rugby or cricket or whatever it is, I can do that. And those experiences which help forge your sense of being part of a team, that help build your sense of self-esteem, confidence in your own body, they make a difference to how you can operate in the world as a young woman, which still has, as we know, challenges around sexism. It hasn't gone away. It is still there. And I think that is one of the big legacies that we can forge those of us who are involved in women's sport. It has this ripple out effect for so many young girls and young women, which I think can be profound. And that's one of the huge reasons why I think we have to put our arms around this sort of these precious little sprouting roots of women's sport and make sure that they can go on and strengthen in the years to come.
And do you feel women's sport has more of that opportunity than men's sport, perhaps, in terms of its social impact?
I think women's sport has a particular impact, going back to the conversation we've just had around issues for young girls and women in particular. I think what's been really interesting in the lockdown period that the podcasts that the Lionesses have done have been hugely successful in terms of their reached out to millions of young people, slightly more successful, I'd say, than their male counterparts. At the same time, I think some of male footballers, and we've just seen, the Rashford school meals vouchers intervention, that I also think for some of the footballers, they're also seeing that they can be a force for change. And I think players finding their voice, whether it's against racism or abuse or championing causes of social justice, I think that's one of the lessons coming out of this pandemic. And I hope that it's something that we will see continuing, and that sponsors aligning themselves, be it to men's sport or to women's sport. I think the point about aligning yourself to purpose beyond the joy of your team winning, the tragedy of it losing, I think that's one of the changes that we are beginning to see. And I think women's sport has amazing values around that connectivity to its audience and to what it's trying to do, as do some of those male players. And so I think that's why there's another opportunity to forge a different set of alliances and links going forward.
Good. I agree with you on the kind of being positive and taking the positive message forward, not being self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? You've obviously spent a huge amount of your career in traditionally men's world, and when I've seen you on television, etc., you always exude this air of utter confidence. I guess one of my questions is, are you always as confident as you appear to be when you're...
No, I mean, I think the art of leadership is absolutely be able to stand the ground and hold onto that moment and hopefully bring people with you because you have persuaded them, you've motivated them, they feel empowered or enlivened to do so. But do I have my own fears and insecurities? Absolutely. Do I think, have I done enough? Did I do that right? Should I have done something different all the time? And many times you don't know the answers to the questions, and people are looking at you thinking, I don't know. These are big, huge questions. So no, I don't feel that level of confidence all the time. What I have is a fantastic family and friends who I can go, what do we do now? What do I do now? And I also think, I suppose for me, one of the important points about if you've been fortunate enough to be in leadership positions is to recognise that you always have to learn, and you learn from so many other people. You learn from everybody who you can come across in organisations or people you talk to. And it is only by staying open to learning, I think, that you can try and improve what it is you're trying, you're seeking to do and to achieve. And I think if you didn't feel insecure, if you didn't feel that anxiety at times, then I think you're not as effective because you stop listening. And I think you can become arrogant and all of those other attributes that sometimes we see in leaders. And I think they don't serve the purpose of, what you're trying to do, because it's all about working with other people. It's never that one person changes the world. It's all about how together you change the world for one person, I think that's why women, I was talking about this the other day, I think, you look at the countries that have come out of the pandemic the quickest, they've all been led by women. And what does that speaks to something in particular. And I'm not saying that they haven't, Greece has come out really well and they're led primarily by men. So I'm not saying that, you cannot get countries through the pandemics but but there's something particular that's happened. And that, I think, is profound, and we should try and really understand that. And I think part of that is to do with that. What those women have shown is that incredible mix of being empathetic, of reaching out and putting your arms around people, of saying you can feel scared and yet you can be decisive at the same time. And that it's not about the ego, it is about collaboration. And those are really powerful messages. And I think that there's something about being women that enables us to speak in that voice, because that is who we are. I think we've all had experiences on that route to leadership where you've been in a room and you've been ignored and you've been not being listened to, or that your idea has been hijacked by the next speaker who happens to be a white male. And the way that you get heard is by making those relationships and alliances with other people. And some of that learning, I think, is absolutely relevant to what it is that one's trying to do today.
Brilliant. That's good. That's fantastic. And just in closing, you've talked in the past, I guess, talk about those amazing women that are transforming the world in terms of politics. And I know in the past you've been a little bit linked with running for London Mayor. Or is politics something that we might see of you in the future?
No. I mean, I for me, it's much more about being involved on the movement side. I'm involved with Time's Up, so trying to really push for representation and equity of women and women of colour, and to shift culture is for me something I really want to now focus on. And that's not about being aligned to a political party. That's about trying to, again, get a sense of an adhesion of interest across employers that says we have to change culture and what happens to women in this place of work, and particularly now that places of work are blurred between home and wherever we're going to be. So no, that's where I want to focus my whatever energy I have left in my in the few years I might still have available to me. That's my focus of attention.
Thanks so much to Heather for taking the time to talk to me during lockdown. There's so much we can all learn from her fabulous attitude to leadership. We'll watch with interest to see the ongoing impact the Women's Sports Group has on the commercialisation of women's sport in the years ahead. I do feel that if anyone can make a difference, it's going to be Heather and her team. If you're enjoying the Game Changers, then please do tell your friends and family about the podcast. If you could share details on social media and take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen, I'd be hugely grateful. Thanks again to the fantastic team at Barclays for kindly supporting the Game Changers. You can find out more about all the guests from this and the previous series at fearlesswomen.co.uk. And thanks also to my rather wonderful executive producer for the series, Sam Walker from What Goes On Media. Next week, I'm talking to Chelsea's extraordinary manager, Emma Hayes. Having twice led Chelsea to the FA Cup and Super League double, once again this year, Emma's team won the Barclays FA WSL. It's a fascinating discussion where Emma talks very openly about her life, her career, and shares lots of advice for others hoping to be high-level coaches in the future.
So it wasn't like I had aspirations and dreams to become a professional footballer. I had a dream to become Glenn Hoddle, but never a female equivalent. I think that in itself has been a key driver in why I've wanted to drive the sport, is I've wanted little girls to have a different dream than I did have.
The Game Changers. Fearless women in sport.